intense. And right there, in the middle of all that drama, this really solemn ceremony is about to happen. It involves blood, promises, and this new document that's going to be like the foundation for their whole community.
Exactly. It's a huge moment, a covenant being formally, ratified between Yahuwah and the sons of Israel.
So today on the deep dive, we're going to zoom in on that specific event and the actual text at the center of it all, the Book of the Covenant.
And for this deep dive, our main source is right there in Exodus, chapters 20 through 24. We're using the DDSV translation, so you'll hear us use the name Yahuwah as it appears there.
Right. And our goal really is to get a handle on the promises made. They're pretty weighty, and also dig into the specific rules laid out in this foundational document.
And of course, walk through the dramatic events themselves. How exactly was this deal sealed there at Mount Sinai?
Yeah, trying to understand what this group, fresh out of generations of slavery, what they were actually agreeing to, and how that agreement was made official in such a powerful visual way.
Okay, let's set the scene first. This is mainly from Exodus 24, the first 8 verses or so. Yahuwah calls Moses up the mountain, but interestingly, not just Moses.
No, he tells him to bring Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel too.
Right, but there's a distinction, isn't there? They're supposed to worship from a distance. Only Moses is to go up close.
Exactly. The people themselves have to stay back at the foot of the mountain. It sets up this clear structure. Moses is the main go-between, the intermediary.
But it also gives the elders and priests a special status, closer than everyone else.
For sure. It kind of reflects the hierarchy being established.
Now, here's something really important, I think, in verse 3. Before any ceremony happens, Moses comes down and tells the people everything. He recounts all the words of Yahuwah and all the ordinances.
Yeah, that's crucial. They weren't just asked to sign on blindly, They actually heard the terms first.
And their response? It's pretty immediate.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Unified, too. They all shout back, basically, everything Yahuwah has said, we will do. Just like that. A big collective yes, right away.
So, okay, he's got their verbal agreement. What does Moses do next to prepare for the actual ceremony?
Well, he gets up early the next morning, and first he writes down all the words. He creates the actual document, the Book of the Covenant they just agreed to verbally.
Okay, so he's got the written terms now.
Then he builds an altar right there at the foot of the mountain. And significantly, he also sets up 12 pillars. The text explicitly says these represent the 12 tribes of Israel.
Okay. So the altar represents Yahuwah, and the 12 pillars represent the 12 tribes, the people.
Precisely. It's like a physical setup showing the two parties involved in this covenant.
Makes sense. What else?
Then he gets some young men from the Israelites to offer sacrifices, burnt offerings, and peace offerings. And these sacrifices, well, they provide the blood needed for the ritual.
Right, the blood. What does he do with it?
He takes the blood, divides it in half, puts half of it carefully into basins. The other half, he sprinkles it directly onto the altar.
Okay, hold on. Half on the altar, half set aside in basins. Why split it like that? What's the thinking there?
Well, it seems to visually represent the two sides of this partnership, right? The blood on the altar is directed towards God's presence, you could say.
And the blood in the basins.
That's reserved for the people. It's like setting aside this incredibly precious thing, life, symbolized by the blood for each party in this sacred agreement before they're formally joined by it.
Got it. So the preparations are done, the stage is set. How does the actual sealing of the covenant happen?
This is where it gets really dramatic. Moses takes that document, the Book of the Covenant he just wrote down.
The one they already agreed to verbally.
Exactly. And he reads it again. But this time, the text specifically says he reads it in the hearing of the people who are all gathered there.
Okay, so a second reading. Why repeat it?
Well, it reinforces it, doesn't it? It makes sure they're not just going off memory from the first time. They're hearing the specific written terms read out loud right at the moment they're about to be formally bound to them.
And their response this time?
It's even stronger. They don't just say, we will do it. They add something. They say, all that Yahuwah has spoken, we will do, and we will be obedient.
And we will be obedient. That adds another layer, doesn't it? More emphasis, more commitment.
Definitely. And it's right after that declaration that Moses takes the blood from the basins, the half that was set aside.
People's half.
Yes. And he sprinkles it on the people themselves.
Wow. Sprinkling blood directly on the people. That sounds incredibly intense, visceral even. What did that signify? Why do that?
I mean, this is really the climax, the sealing act of the ratification. As he sprinkles the blood, Moses declares, "You will pay attention to the blood of the covenant, which Yahuwah has made with you, in accordance with all these words.
The blood of the covenant.
Yeah, the blood, representing life, is used here to make the agreement solemn, binding. It connects the people's own lives directly to the terms they just agreed to. It makes the promises real, mutual. It basically signifies that entering this covenant is a life and death commitment. Their lives are now bound to obeying all these words.
It's such a powerful physical act. It must have really driven home the seriousness of the whole thing for everyone there.
No doubt about it.
So, okay. They've made this incredibly solemn promise, sealed it with blood, all based on the words Moses wrote down and read to them. Which leads us to the obvious question. What were all these words? What was actually in this book of the covenant that they agreed to twice?
Exactly. That's the core of it, isn't it?
It-
Let's unpack the content, which we find mostly in Exodus chapters 20 through 23.
All right. So Exodus 20. This really lays the groundwork, the absolute foundation. It kicks off with Yahuwah introducing himself not just as some abstract god, but very specifically as the one who brought them out of Egypt, out of slavery.
Right. That context is everything. He's their deliverer. And that deliverance creates an obligation, a basis for the relationship.
And right after that, we get the big ones, the core requirements, what most people call the Ten Commandments.
Yep, the heart of the covenant's ethical and relational rules, and you can kind of group them. First, they're the ones about their relationship with God.
Right.
Like Yahuwah is the only almighty creator they're supposed to worship. No idols. Show reverence for his name. And set aside the Sabbath day for rest and worship. Those are fundamental.
Okay, that's the God-focused part. Then there's the other side, right,
Yeah.
how they treat each other.
Exactly. Just as crucial, honoring parents. And then the big prohibitions against things that tear a community apart. Murder, adultery, stealing, bearing false witness, lying about your neighbor, and even coveting, wanting what belongs to someone else.
So these 10 Commandments, they're like the non-negotiables, the bedrock principles.
Pretty much. They define loyalty to Yahuwah and the basic rules for living right within the community that he's forming.
Now, we mentioned earlier how terrifying the whole scene on the mountain was, the thunder, lightning, smoke, the trumpet.
Yeah, the people were genuinely scared. So scared, in fact, that they basically told Moses, look, you talk to God and tell us what he says. If God keeps talking to us directly, we're going to die.
Which explains why Moses becomes the main channel for the rest of the law that follows.
Right. He reassures them, says God is testing them, that this fear should actually help keep them from sinning. And even before we get into the really detailed laws, there are these initial simple instructions about building altars.
Oh, yeah. What kind?
Very simple ones. Made of earth, or if using stones, they have to be uncut natural stones.
Yeah.
And pointedly, no steps leading up to them.
No steps. Why not?
The reason given is to avoid exposing nakedness during worship. It immediately sets this tone against maybe the more elaborate or potentially showy or immodest practices of other cultures. Keep it simple. Keep it respectful.
Okay. So Exodus 20 gives us the 10 Commandments, the foundation, plus these first rules about altars. But you said the Book of the Covenant covers chapters 21 through 23 as well. That sounds like a lot more detail.
Oh, it is. Think of chapters 21 to 23 as the practical legal code. It's like the case law that takes those big principles from the 10 Commandments and applies them to everyday life.
So specifics.
Yeah, specifics on civil disputes, criminal justice, social welfare stuff, property rights. I mean, it covers a huge range. It's basically the blueprint for the kind of just and righteous society Yahuwah wants them to build. We can maybe look at them in terms of themes.
Okay, what's a major theme that stands out?
Well, one huge area is justice and fairness in personal relations. This starts right off with laws about people, including rules for Hebrew slaves.
Slavery laws, how did that work in the covenant?
Well, it puts limits on it. A Hebrew slave serves for 6 years, but must be set free in the 7th year. No ifs, ands, or buts. It also deals with more complex situations, like if a male slave is given a wife by his master and they have kids.
What happens then?
The wife and kids belong to the master. But if the slave wants to stay with his family and master out of loyalty, there's a provision for him to become a permanent servant, marked by this unique ceremony where his ear is pierced against a doorpost.
Interesting. What about female slaves?
There are different rules for them, too. The point seems to be ensuring they aren't just treated like property to be discarded. If a master takes a female slave, maybe intending her for himself or his son, and then is displeased or takes another wife, he can't just sell her off to foreigners. He still has obligations to provide her with food, clothing, and marital rights, or else she goes free without paying anything.
That level of detail, even regulating slavery, is pretty striking for the time. What about more violent crimes?
Oh yeah, the laws are very specific there. Capital offenses are listed clearly. Premeditated murder, striking or even cursing your parents, kidnapping, these are things that just fundamentally break down the family and community.
Is there a difference between intentional killing and accidental?
Yes, absolutely. The law makes a distinction. If it's accidental manslaughter, there's a provision for a place of refuge where the person can flee.
Yeah.
But for premeditated murder, the penalty is death, no escape.
And this is where the famous eye for eye, tooth for tooth idea comes in, right? Lex talionis.
Exactly. It appears in the section about personal injury. If people fight and someone gets hurt, there are rules for compensation, paying for lost time, medical care. The eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot principle is stated there.
How should we understand that? Was it meant literally?
Well, scholars debate that, but it's generally understood within a legal context. It wasn't necessarily a command for individuals to go take personal revenge. It was more likely a principle for judges to ensure that the punishment or restitution was proportional to the crime or injury. It limits retaliation, preventing it from escalating. So the penalty fits the crime, but isn't excessive.
Okay, that makes sense. What about property? That's always a big area in any legal system.
For sure. Laws concerning property and restitution are really extensive in Exodus 21 and 22. Theft is a big one.
What were the penalties for stealing?
It involved restitution, paying back more than you stole. The scale varied. If you stole an ox and slaughtered or sold it, you had to pay back 5 oxen. For a sheep, it was 4 sheep. If the stolen animal was found alive in your possession, you pay back double.
So the goal was making the victim whole and then some.
Exactly. There are also rules about thieves caught breaking in, distinguishing between breaking in at night, where the homeowner might use lethal force in self-defense, versus during the day, where the assumption was you could apprehend the thief and bring them to justice.
What about accidental damage?
It's covered, too. Like if your livestock wanders and grazes in someone else's field, you have to make restitution from the best of your own field. Same if you start a fire that spreads and damages someone's crops. It establishes liability.
And financial stuff. Loans, deposits.
Yep. Rules for things entrusted to a neighbor for safekeeping what happens if it's stolen. Rules about loans. And a really key one. You cannot charge interest if you lend money to a poor person among your people.
A protection for the vulnerable.
Absolutely. And if you take someone's cloak as collateral for a loan, remember, for many poor people, their cloak was also their blanket at night. You absolutely had to return it by sunset so they wouldn't freeze. It shows this deep, practical concern for the basic needs of the poor.
That definitely highlights another clear theme. Protection for the vulnerable.
It's woven throughout. Like the explicit command, you will not oppress a stranger. And the reason given hits hard. Since you yourselves know the feelings of a stranger, for you also were strangers in the land of Egypt.
Using their own painful history to teach empathy. Powerful.
Isn't it? And the same goes for widows and orphans. The language is incredibly strong. You will not afflict any widow or orphan.
And there's a consequence if you do.
Oh, yes. Yahuwah says he will surely hear their cry if they are mistreated, and his anger will flare up, and he will essentially bring disaster upon the oppressors. It shows God positioning himself as the defender of the most defenseless members of society.
Wow. Okay, what else? Any laws about maintaining social order or religious purity?
Yes, definitely. There are prohibitions against things like sorcery, bestiality, and explicitly sacrificing to any god other than Yahuwah. These were seen as totally corrupting the covenant relationship in the community itself.
Undermining the very foundation.
Exactly. There's also a command not to curse God, and interestingly, not to curse rulers either, showing respect for both divine and human authority structures.
And it's not just about not doing bad things, right? There are positive commands about justice, too.
Absolutely. Don't spread false reports. Don't just follow the crowd if they're doing something wrong or trying to twist justice. Don't be partial in court, and that includes not showing favoritism even to a poor person, just to make sure justice is truly impartial, truly blind.
That's a high standard.
It really is. And then there's that surprising one about helping your enemy.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about that again.
If you see your enemy's ox or donkey wandering off, you don't just ignore it. You have to take it back to them. And if you see their donkey collapsed under its load, you can't just walk by. You have to stop and help them get it unloaded.
Wow. That goes way beyond just being neutral. That's active help for someone you might dislike.
It really embodies a higher standard of behavior, doesn't it?
Sure.
It shows these laws weren't just a dry legal code. They were painting a picture of compassionate, just community Yahuwah wanted them to be.
Okay, so we've covered personal relations, property, protecting the vulnerable, justice. What about the later part of chapter 23? You said it shifts focus.
Yeah, it moves more towards religious practice and preparing for life in the land they were promised.
Like the Sabbath.
Well, yes, the weekly Sabbath rest is reinforced, making sure everyone, including servants and resident aliens, gets that day off. But there's also the sabbatical year.
A whole year.
Yeah, every seventh year, the agricultural land itself was supposed to lie fallow to rest. You couldn't intentionally sow or reap your fields.
Why do that? Was it just about letting the soil recover?
That might have been a side benefit. But the reason given in the text is social and theological. Whatever grew on its own during that year was for the poor of the land to eat and for the wild animals. It's this built-in principle of provision for the needy and acknowledging God's ownership of the land tied into the rhythm of time.
That's fascinating. A kind of ecological and social safety net rolled into one.
Kind of, yeah. And alongside these time-based laws, there's another really strict warning that pops up again.
About
Other gods. Be on your guard and do not mention the name of other gods, nor let them be heard from your mouth. As they're getting closer to entering Canaan, a land full of other religions, this warning about exclusive loyalty gets hammered home again.
And the major festivals are laid out here too.
Yes, the 3 big annual pilgrimage festivals are commanded. The Feast of Unleavened Bread, remembering the Exodus. The Feast of Harvest, celebrating the first fruits of the wheat harvest, also called Pentecost later. And the Feast of Ingathering, at the end of the agricultural year, celebrating the final harvest.
And everyone had to go.
All the males were required to appear before Yahuwah at these 3 times each year. It was a way to unify the nation, remind them of God's acts and provision, and reinforce their shared identity. There are also a couple of specific ritual rules mentioned here, like not offering sacrificial blood with leavened bread, and that somewhat mysterious one, you will not boil a young goat in its mother's milk.
Okay. And the very end of the Book of the Covenant, what does that cover?
The final section really focuses on God's promises and warnings regarding the conquest and settling the land.
So looking ahead.
Exactly. God promises to send an angel ahead of them to guide them, protect them on the way, and bring them into the promised land. He promises that if they obey this angel and his voice, he will be an enemy to their enemies.
And he promises to drive out the current inhabitants.
Yes, he lists them: Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Canaanites, Hivites, Jebusites. He commits to clearing the land for them.
But you mentioned earlier, he said he'd do it little by little, not all at once.
Right, and the reason given is quite practical. If he drove everyone out instantly, the land would become desolate before the Israelites had multiplied enough to fill it, and wild animals would take over. So it would be a gradual process. He even mentions sending hornets ahead of them, maybe metaphorically or literally, to help drive people out.
And he sets the boundaries for the land, they're promised.
Yes, vast boundaries. From the Red Sea, or Sea of Reeds, up to the Mediterranean, the Sea of the Philistines, and from the wilderness in the south up towards the Euphrates River, he promises to give the inhabitants into their hand.
But these incredible promises, they come with some serious warnings, don't they?
Absolutely critical warnings, probably the most crucial in this whole section, given what happens later in their history. They are explicitly commanded. You will make no covenant with them, the inhabitants of the land, or with the almighty creators.
No treaties, no alliances.
None. And even more directly, they will not live in your land, because they will make you sin against me. For if you serve the almighty creators, it will surely be a snare to you.
Wow. So the biggest danger isn't military defeat, it's religious assimilation. It's being drawn away from Yahuwah.
That's presented as the ultimate threat. The snare isn't just adopting some customs, it's serving other gods, which would break the covenant completely. So maintaining that separation, that religious purity, is presented as absolutely paramount for their survival and success in the land.
Okay, let's pull back for a second. We've covered quite a bit. We started with that dramatic scene at Sinai, the mountain, the pledges, the blood sealing the deal.
Yeah, witnessing the people's strong commitment stated twice. We'll do, and we will be obedient.
And then we dove into the actual content of this Book of the Covenant, and it's incredibly detailed, isn't it? It covers everything from the core 10 commandments, basic ethics,
to specific laws about property disputes, loans, personal injury, protecting the poor and strangers, rules for worship, the festivals.
And finally, the promises and strict warnings about entering the land and dealing with the people already there.
You know, looking at it all together, this wasn't just like a list of religious rules. It was basically the constitution for this brand new nation emerging from Egypt.
A constitution, yeah. It laid out their justice system, their economy, their social safety nets, how they should treat each other, how they should relate to God, their whole national identity.
It really reveals this comprehensive vision for a society that was meant to be set apart, different, defined by its covenant relationship with Yahuwah.
And when you think about that level of detail we talked about, I mean, it goes from foundational principles like do not murder, all the way down to what to do if your ox gores someone, or the requirement to help your enemy's struggling donkey, or ensuring even your servants and the animals get a Sabbath rest. What does that granularity, that level of detail, tell you about the kind of society this covenant was aiming to create?
I think it tells us that this covenant was meant to shape every part of life. It wasn't supposed to be just a Sunday thing, It wasn't just a set of abstract beliefs. It was intended as a practical, day-to-day guide for living in a way that reflected the justice and compassion of the God who had rescued them. It aimed to embed those values right into their laws, their economy, their social interactions.
So we've taken this deep dive into the Book of the Covenant, saw how it was dramatically ratified at Sinai. We heard the people, fresh out of slavery, declare, all that Yahuwah has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient, and then saw that commitment sealed with blood. A truly pivotal moment setting the stage for everything that followed.
Definitely. And reflecting on this foundational text, this comprehensive blueprint for a nation, and the profound commitment it demanded, maybe here's something for you, the listener, to think about. Given just how comprehensive these laws are, touching on pretty much every area of life, from personal ethics to social justice, property rights, religious practice, and those stark warnings about assimilation, how challenging do you think it would actually be for any community, back then or even now, to truly live up to every single point of this covenant? What parts of it strike you as the most surprising or maybe the most difficult to imagine putting into practice consistently?
What stood out to you in this deep dive? Something to ponder until next time.